To exist is to bloom in the shadow of absence, an endless unfolding of flesh and thought rooted in the unknown. We rise toward light that will never warm us and fall to ash before we understand why we began. The bloom is not mercy, nor malice. It simply is. And so are we. I wake every morning to the same grey hum, the barely perceptible thrum of life as it churns along without pause or purpose. The alarm clock buzzes like an insect trapped in amber, shaking me free from the only peace I've ever known. I stare at the ceiling, counting the faint cracks that spiderweb outward, resembling the brittle lines of something ready to shatter. I rise, not because I want to, but because there's an expectation. I shower, dress, and sip stale coffee by the window, watching people shuffle down the street with deadened eyes. It's always struck me how mechanical we've all become. Each of us an automaton, fueled by rituals we never chose. Outside, the morning fog clings to the asphalt like a shroud. The world is quiet, but not serene. It's the quiet of a room that has been empty for too long. As I step outside, the thought returns. It always does. Why does it feel like I'm being punished? I've asked myself that question for years, but it's taken on a sharper edge lately. It's not just the mundane grind of work and sleep, the slow erosion of wonder. No, it's deeper than that. There's a weight to my very existence, a heaviness that seeps into my bones and makes each breath feel like an obligation. At work, the fluorescent lights hum overhead, their artificial glow bleaching the office walls into something sterile and lifeless. My co-workers exchange pleasantries, their conversations shallow and scripted. "How was your weekend?" "Same as always." Their words loop like a broken record, replaying without deviation. Today, something feels different. Off in a way I can't name. It's in the way time stretches and contracts, the seconds grinding forward like rusty gears. A fleeting flicker of movement in the corner of my eye makes me turn, but there's nothing there, just the same worn-down office furniture and blank faces. When lunch comes, I sit alone beneath the skeletal trees in the courtyard, chewing without tasting. A bird lands nearby, its feathers ruffled and dull. It doesn't sing, just stares at me, unblinking. Its silence feels accusatory. Am I supposed to feel something, I wonder? Am I supposed to find meaning in any of this? The sky is cloudless, pale as bone. I can't shake the sense that I'm standing in a photograph, something frozen and static. By the time I return home, the day has bled out, leaving nothing behind. I kick off my shoes and collapse onto the couch, staring at the muted television. I don't remember turning it on. Static crackles faintly before cutting to a sitcom rerun I've seen a dozen times, the laugh track chiming in at all the right moments. But tonight, the sound of laughter unsettles me. It's too loud, too hollow. The actors grin and gesture with an unnatural exuberance, their faces stretched too wide. For a brief, terrifying moment, I feel like I'm watching something inhuman mimic joy. I turn off the TV and the room falls silent again. The hum is still there, low, constant, and just beneath my threshold of hearing. I close my eyes, hoping to drift into sleep, but the thought returns, sinking its claws into me. This can't be life. It feels too much like a punishment. I woke up to darkness, not knowing how I'd gotten there. My first instinct was to check my phone for the time, but when I pressed the button, the screen stayed black. The power must have died overnight. I sat up slowly, the room tilting around me. The faint hum that always accompanied the silence of my apartment had disappeared, replaced by something far worse, absolute quiet. I moved to the window and pulled back the curtains. The street below was empty. The fog still lingered from the morning before, hanging thick like something alive. No people, no cars. Only the dim glow of the streetlights, pale halos in the mist. I blinked, trying to piece together what time it was or how long I'd been out. When I turned around, the familiarity of the room twisted. My furniture, my books, my life. They were all in place, but they felt wrong. Too pristine, too arranged, like a memory someone had tried to recreate rather than the real thing. I walked to the kitchen to splash water on my face, the cold biting against my skin. But when I raised my head to look at my reflection, I froze. My face was there, but it was slow to mimic me. When I tilted my head, the reflection hesitated just for a second. long enough for my pulse to spike and my stomach to churn. I leaned closer. The reflection stared back, lips parting slightly as if it wanted to speak but didn't know how. My breath fogged the glass, blurring its eyes, but not enough to hide the faint glimmer of something else watching from beneath the surface. I stumbled back, knocking a glass off the counter. The shatter brought the world rushing back in. The hum returned, low and droning, like the sound of a distant machine. I sat at the edge of my bed, gripping my phone like a lifeline. It blinked back to life suddenly. 3:27 a.m. The notification bar was empty. No missed calls, no messages, nothing to anchor me to the mundane rhythms of life. I stared at the screen, willing a text to come through, some sign of connection. But the minutes stretched on in sterile silence. That's when I heard it, the faint murmur of a voice. At first, I thought it was coming from the hallway, but when I pressed my ear to the door, the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was beneath me, like something speaking through the floorboards. I knelt, heart pounding, and pressed my hand to the cold wood. The voice was there, faint and distorted, but unmistakable. It wasn't speaking a language I knew. It wasn't really speaking at all. It was more like a feeling, wrapped in sound, and the only thing I could grasp was its intent. "You've seen too much." I stumbled back, breathing heavily. My apartment felt like a trap now, the walls pressing in too close. I grabbed my coat and left, slamming the door behind me. The street outside was almost identical to before, empty, quiet. But now there was a strange warmth to the fog, as though it was alive and breathing. I walked without direction, my legs carrying me further into the haze. The city I thought I knew blurred around me. Buildings flickered at the edges of my vision, warping between what I remembered and something unfamiliar. I crossed intersections that shouldn't have existed, past storefronts with signs written in a language that didn't belong to this world. I stopped in front of a small diner I'd never seen before. The windows glowed with a sickly yellow light, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I reached for the door. The bell above it chimed, a soft, hollow note that set my teeth on edge. The diner was empty except for a man sitting at the far end of the counter. His back was to me, his frame hunched and still. He wore a long coat that hung off his shoulders like a discarded skin. I hesitated, the urge to leave clawing at me, but something kept me rooted in place. The man shifted slightly, as though he'd heard my thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried a weight that crushed the air around it. "You're finally starting to see it, aren't you?" My heart stuttered in my chest. I wanted to ask what he meant, but my throat had gone dry. The man turned just enough for me to see the side of his face, pale, scarred, and unfamiliar. His eyes shimmered like they weren't made for this world. "This place," he said, "isn't what you think it is. It never was." I took a step back toward the door, but he raised a hand, not in warning, but as if to steady me. "You've felt it, haven't you?" he asked. "The weight? The dislocation? That's because this isn't life. It's a replica, something stitched together from the ashes of something far worse." The hum returned, louder this time, drowning out his words. The walls of the diner seemed to pulse, as though the building itself was breathing. I blinked, and in that brief moment, the man was gone. The diner was empty. The hum faded, replaced by the clatter of a distant kitchen and the normal sounds of a quiet restaurant. I staggered outside, clutching my coat tighter as the fog swallowed the streets again. But I knew I'd heard him. And worse, I knew he was right. Something in this world was unraveling. And I was the only one who could see the seams. By the time the fog began to lift, the horizon had that grey pre-dawn hue, the kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as reveal the empty spaces in the world. I didn't know how long I'd been walking, only that I wasn't tired. I was too aware of everything, the scrape of my shoes against the pavement, the weight of my breath in the cold air, the hum that had embedded itself in the back of my skull like a needle threading through bone. I found myself at the edge of the riverbank, staring at the slow black current below. The water moved lazily, like something dragging itself along. The world felt dead here. No birds, no passing cars, just the soft hiss of water against stone. Then I saw him. The man from the diner stood a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back. He was facing the river, his reflection broken and warped by the rippling water. "You're early," he said without turning around. The words tightened around my chest like a snare. "I don't know what you mean," I said. My voice sounded small, barely above a whisper. The man chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. He finally turned to face me fully. Up close, his features were even more unsettling. His eyes were too steady, too knowing. His face seemed carved, like something approximating humanity, but missing the finer details. "You've been feeling it your whole life," he said. "You just didn't know how to name it. The cracks in the world, the weight pressing down on your soul." He paused, tilting his head. "You thought you were the only one." I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. "What is this place?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He stepped closer, and I fought the urge to back away. His coat shifted with his movement, hanging loose and heavy, like it didn't belong to him. "This is where you are meant to be," he said, almost gently. "Where we're all meant to be." The hum grew louder again, a low vibration that made the ground tremble beneath my feet. The man's eyes flickered toward the sky. "We don't call it life," he continued, his voice soft. "We call it what it is: punishment." A cold weight settled over me, denser than fear. It wasn't just the words, it was the certainty in his voice. I took a step forward despite the dread crawling up my spine. "Punishment for what?" I asked. He gave me a sad smile. "For being..." The simplicity of the answer left me reeling. I wanted to argue, to push back against the absurdity of it. But some part of me knew he was right. There was no crime to absolve, no redemption to seek. Only the endless weight of existing. "You're close to seeing it," he said, his gaze darkening. "But seeing is a curse, not a blessing." He gestured to the river, where the reflection of the sky above had begun to shimmer unnaturally. "There's no waking up from this." The sky's reflection bled and twisted, taking on shapes that defied language. Blooms of shadowed tendrils, spirals that bent inward like collapsing stars. I stared, mesmerized and horrified. I could feel something vast stirring behind the fragile illusion of the world. I turned back to the man, but he was already gone. No footsteps, no sound of departure, just the hiss of the river and the lingering hum. I stood there alone with the rising sun and the terrible understanding that I had just glimpsed something that couldn't be unseen. This isn't life, I thought, staring at the water's bloom. This is something else. I went back to work the next day, though I don't remember getting there. My hands were already on the keyboard when I looked up and realized I was at my desk, the office bathed in the same stale glow of fluorescent lights. The hum was still there, faint but constant, threading through the air like an invisible wire. I stared at my monitor as emails and notifications stacked up like meaningless bricks in a wall I'd never finish building. Words became static, paragraphs blurred into grey shapes. I clicked through them without reading, my mind circling the same thought. What is this place? Around me, my co-workers carried on as though the world hadn't shifted beneath our feet. Rebecca from accounting laughed too loudly at a joke I couldn't hear. Mike from IT walked by with a smile too bright for the morning gloom. The sounds of small talk buzzed through the air like flies circling an open wound. It felt staged, every word, every movement. "Long night?" a voice called from over the cubicle wall. I turned and saw my co-worker Jeremy leaning over, a cup of coffee in his hand and a grin plastered across his face. The familiarity of it was nauseating. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. My voice felt hollow, like I was mimicking the person I was supposed to be. He nodded, oblivious, and kept talking. Something about his weekend plans, a new show he was binging, some happy distraction. I tried to listen, but the words didn't reach me. They hovered in the space between us, devoid of weight or meaning. I watched him, really watched him, and for the first time I noticed how rehearsed it all seemed. The way he nodded after every third sentence, the way he sipped his coffee at just the right pause. It was like a script he'd been given long ago, one he didn't know he was following. A memory flickered in my mind, my reflection in the mirror, that hesitation before it moved. I felt the same disconnection now, like Jeremy's face was a mask barely holding its shape. "I should get back to work," I muttered. He smiled a beat too slow and returned to his desk. The hum seemed louder now, wrapping around the sounds of the office, dulling everything else. During lunch, I sat in the break room alone. The others came and went in waves, laughing, chatting, eating microwaved leftovers, but I stayed anchored in my chair, watching the clock on the wall. It was broken. The second hand twitched, but never moved forward. I thought of the stranger's words. This isn't life, it's a replica. The thought itched at the back of my mind, burrowing deeper with each passing second. Clock's been like that for weeks, someone said behind me. I turned to see Rebecca pouring coffee into a mug, her smile warm but distant. We've asked maintenance to fix it, but you know how it is. I nodded, though the thought of the clock never moving felt symbolic in a way she couldn't understand. She sat across from me, stirring sugar into her coffee. You've been quiet today. Just tired, I said automatically. But the words caught in my throat, and I realized I didn't want to lie, not today. Do you ever feel like something's off? Rebecca blinked at me, her expression shifting ever so slightly. Off, like everything's wrong. The way people talk, the way time moves. I leaned forward, lowering my voice, like none of this is real. For a moment she just stared at me. Then she laughed, the sound brittle and strained. Wow, you really do need a vacation, she said, standing up and grabbing her coffee. Take some time off, you'll feel better. I watched her walk away, my heart sinking. I hadn't expected her to understand, but I'd hoped for something more than dismissal. I was alone with the broken clock again, watching its second hand twitch uselessly. When I returned to my desk, my inbox was flooded with new emails, most of them tagged urgent. I didn't open them. Instead, I stared at the wall, listening to the hum, letting it fill the hollow spaces inside me. That's when my phone buzzed. A single text message, no number attached. You see it now. My chest tightened. I glanced around the office, half expecting to see someone watching me, but everything looked normal. Or what passed for normal here. Another message appeared. They don't know what they are, but you do. I locked my phone and shoved it into my pocket, my pulse racing. I needed air. I grabbed my coat and left without a word, the sound of typing and low conversations fading behind me. Outside, the sky was pale and empty. The wind tugged at my sleeves as I walked, my thoughts circling back to the diner, to the stranger's warning. I passed rows of cars, their windows dark and lifeless. For the first time, I noticed that there were no reflections in the glass, just a blank, shimmering void where my face should have been. I stopped and stared at my own absence, the realization like a cold knife sliding between my ribs. This isn't life, I thought again, the words ringing like a funeral bell in my mind. It's something pretending to be. The fog returned that evening, curling through the streets like a living thing. I walked home beneath its weight, my breath rising in thin clouds. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting halos of dim, jaundiced light onto the sidewalk. I didn't bother turning on the TV when I got home. It felt pointless. The laughter of sitcom characters was an insult now, an echo of something I couldn't reach. I sat on the couch and stared at the window. Outside, the world was still. No passing cars, no people on their way home, just the same hum threading through the quiet. It had followed me here, sinking into every corner of my apartment. I stood and walked toward the hallway mirror, the same mirror where, the night before, I'd seen something wrong. I wasn't sure why I was drawn to it now, only that I had to look. My reflection stared back, tired and disheveled, but intact. For a moment, I almost laughed at myself. I pressed my hand to the glass, half expecting it to feel soft like water, but it was cold and solid. Then the light shifted. My reflection didn't move. I felt my throat tighten as a strange pressure built behind my eyes. My own face watched me, unblinking, lips slightly parted. I leaned forward, hoping, praying that it was some trick of the light. But I could see it too clearly, see the faint rise and fall of its chest, independent of mine. And then it spoke. "Why are you still here?" The voice was soft but wrong, too close, too familiar. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but the reflection didn't follow. It stayed pressed against the glass like a figure trapped beneath ice. "You shouldn't have stayed." I wanted to scream, to run, but the words froze in my throat. The reflection's face began to change, warping at the edges, its features rippled, melting into something else, something vast and unknowable. For a fraction of a second, I saw it. A mass of endless blooming tendrils writhing beneath the skin of reality. The glass shuddered under its weight, as though the mirror itself was struggling to hold it back. And then it was gone. The mirror was just a mirror again, reflecting the empty hallway behind me. My knees buckled, and I grabbed the doorframe to steady myself. I could still feel the hum, louder now, pulsing through my skull like a heartbeat. I staggered into the living room and grabbed my phone with shaking hands. No new messages, no calls, just silence. I wanted to believe that what I'd seen was a dream or a hallucination, but the cold sweat soaking through my shirt told me otherwise. I scrolled through my contacts until I landed on one I hadn't used in months. My sister Marie. She'd always been the logical one, the one who could make sense of things when I couldn't. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Hey." Her voice was warm but cautious, as if she could hear the fear in my silence. "What's going on?" I don't know how to explain it," I said. My voice cracked, and I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. "Something's wrong, Marie. I think I'm losing it." There was a pause on the other end. When she finally spoke, her tone was softer, almost apologetic. "You've been like this before," she said gently. "Remember last year, after the accident?" I clenched my jaw. She wasn't wrong. I had spiraled after losing someone close. But this wasn't grief. This wasn't trauma. It was something else, something that had been waiting beneath the surface long before I'd ever suffered loss. "This is different," I whispered. "Maybe," she said, but I could tell she didn't believe me. "Look, take a day off. Get some sleep. You've been burning yourself out." I closed my eyes, trying to keep the frustration from boiling over. "Marie, you don't understand. I saw something in the mirror. It wasn't me." The line went quiet for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, unsure. "Maybe you should talk to someone. Professionally." The finality in her tone hurt more than I expected. I ended the call before she could say anything else. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, staring at my reflection in the black screen of the TV. My face was faint, barely visible in the glass. I watched it, waiting for it to change, for it to shift into something else. But it didn't. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, dragging me into a sleep filled with endless corridors of mirrored glass. In the dream, every reflection I passed stared back at me with eyes that didn't belong. At the end of the corridor stood a door, carved with a strange, spiraling bloom. I reached for the handle, but as soon as my fingers touched the cold brass, the hum returned, louder than ever, vibrating through my skull until everything shattered into a blinding white. I woke with a gasp, the hum still lingering like a distant echo. The sun had risen, pale and cold, and my apartment was exactly as I'd left it. But I knew in that quiet moment that the world had shifted again. The mirror had cracked overnight, 3 thin lines running down the center like veins. Whatever was watching me had left a scar behind. The day passed in a haze of silence and shadows. The mirror's crack ran like a fault line through my thoughts, a reminder that something had split open inside the fabric of my reality. At work, I drifted through conversations and tasks without meaning. The hum was there, faint but insistent, like an itch beneath my skull. I caught glimpses of movement at the edges of my vision, faint blurs that disappeared when I turned to look. By the time I left the office, dusk had settled over the city, staining the sky a muted grey blue. The fog rolled in again, thicker this time, swallowing the tops of buildings and muffling the sounds of traffic. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets and walked, letting my feet guide me. As I passed the corner of a familiar intersection, something caught my eye. A shimmer in the air, faint and pulsing. I stopped, heart pounding, as the shimmer coalesced into a shape. A pattern blooming outward, like the petals of a flower, intricate and unnervingly organic. The bloom hung in the air, made of light and shadow. It pulsed faintly, as though breathing, and the longer I stared at it, the more I felt something stirring behind it. A presence vast and indifferent, watching from somewhere far beyond. I reached out, drawn to it despite the fear curling in my chest. The closer my hand got, the more the bloom shifted, as though anticipating my touch. Just before my fingers brushed its edge, a sharp voice cut through the fog. "Don't." I spun around and saw him again, the stranger from the diner, his coat flaring slightly in the wind. His face was the same mask of cold observation, but this time his eyes held something new: urgency. "What? What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. He stepped forward, placing himself between me and the bloom. "A warning." "A warning from what?" The stranger glanced at the shifting petals of light and shadow. "From everything you're not meant to see." His voice was low, measured. "It's a glimpse behind the veil. The bloom of ruin." The name sent a chill down my spine. "What's behind it?" His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something almost human. Grief. The truth. And once you see it, you can't look away. I felt my breath catch. The bloom pulsed again, its tendrils unfurling gently, calling to me without words. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "You were always close," he said. "Some people live their whole lives blind to it. But you've always felt it, haven't you?" I nodded, unable to deny it. The weight of existence, the sense that something was missing, that the world was too hollow to be real. It had been with me for as long as I could remember. The stranger stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "You need to listen to me now. Walk away. Forget what you've seen. It's the only way to stay whole." "And if I don't?" His expression hardened. "Then you'll break." I glanced at the bloom again, mesmerized by its terrible beauty. The hum swelled around me, vibrating through my bones. For a moment I saw past the bloom, saw something vast and infinite coiling through the void. The stranger grabbed my arm, yanking me away with more strength than I expected. The bloom flickered, and for an instant the world seemed to fold in on itself, collapsing into a hollow, silent void. Then the fog returned, thick and impenetrable, and the bloom was gone. We stood there in silence, the hum fading into the distance. I realized I was shaking. The stranger let go of my arm and took a step back. "Why show me this?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I didn't," he said. "It showed itself to you." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And that means it's already started." "What started?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking down the street, his silhouette swallowed by the mist. Panic flared in my chest. "Wait," I called after him. "You can't just leave. What am I supposed to do?" He paused but didn't turn around. "Survive," he said, "if you can." Then he vanished into the fog, leaving me alone beneath the dim streetlights. I stood there, staring at the empty street, the hum now just a faint memory in my ears. The bloom had gone, but I could still feel its presence, like an afterimage burned into my mind. I knew in some quiet, terrifying part of me that it wasn't over. Whatever the bloom was, whatever it had shown me, it wasn't finished. And neither was I. The days that followed were hollow echoes of each other. I drifted through life like a ghost in my own skin, watching the world move around me, but never with me. Conversations turned into background noise, meals into meaningless routines. I barely noticed when the sun rose or set, but the bloom, it lingered. I could see it every time I closed my eyes, the delicate shifting petals of shadow and light, unfurling with a purpose I didn't understand. I started keeping a notebook, filling the pages with everything I could remember. The shape of the bloom, the hum that followed me, the stranger's warning. My handwriting grew messier with each entry, my thoughts unraveling into questions I couldn't answer. Why me? What is the bloom? What happens if I look too closely? I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into books and old philosophical texts I'd long since abandoned. I read Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Camus, looking for any words that might anchor me. Instead, their words felt heavier now. Existence is absurd, they had written, but it is ours. But what if it wasn't? What if this wasn't life, but something else entirely, a prison disguised as freedom? I found myself drawn to older, more obscure writings, fragments of forgotten philosophers who questioned the very fabric of reality. Late one night, I stumbled across an untranslated manuscript online, The Testament of Ash and Bloom. The title felt too familiar, like I'd dreamed it before. The text was dense and labyrinthine, filled with warnings about the bloom of ruin and the hunger of unseen roots. It spoke of a cycle of existence designed not to teach or enlighten, but to grind the soul down to nothingness. The bloom wasn't just a phenomenon, it was a symptom of something deeper. One passage in particular sent a chill through my spine. To bloom is to be seen is to unravel, and from the unraveling no one returns. I read those words over and over, feeling something shift inside me, like the ground beneath my feet had tilted. I barely noticed the hours slipping by. The hum in the background had grown faint, like it was holding its breath. When I finally glanced at the time, it was well past midnight. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of my desk lamp. The air felt thick, like the silence was pressing against my skin. I stood up to stretch when something caught my attention, a low creak, like a footstep, coming from the hallway. I turned toward the sound, heart pounding. The hallway was dark, the cracked mirror reflecting only shadows. But I knew I wasn't alone. I reached for the doorframe, steadying myself. "Who's there?" My voice sounded weak in the stillness. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the walls. The shadows in the mirror shifted, forming shapes that shouldn't exist, long, coiling tendrils that pulsed in time with the hum. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and familiar. "You're almost there." It was my own voice. I stumbled back, knocking a chair over. The notebook slid to the floor, its pages fanning out. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. I wanted to run, to flee from whatever was speaking to me. But something kept me rooted in place. The mirror warped again, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of something vast and terrible. A shape that extended beyond comprehension, blooming through the void like a wound in reality. It stared without eyes, its form rippling with silent purpose. "You've seen the seams," my voice whispered again. "Now follow them." I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. When I opened them, the shadows were gone, the mirror still. The hum receded, but it left a hollow ache in its wake, like something had been torn away. I sank to the floor and grabbed the notebook, holding it like a lifeline. The words on the pages seemed to pulse beneath my fingertips. I knew I was close to something. An answer, maybe, or something far worse. The stranger's warning echoed in my mind. Once you see it, you can't look away. But I wasn't sure I wanted to anymore. Sleep became a distant memory. Whenever I closed my eyes, the bloom was there, unfurling in endless fractals of shadow and light, reaching towards something hidden behind the veil of existence. I stopped trying to fight it. Sleep only invited the abyss to seep in deeper. The visions began the same night I read the manuscript. They weren't dreams, not really. They felt more than real, as though I'd stepped into a world beneath the world. The first vision came in the early hours of the morning. I was standing in an endless corridor lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected not just my face, but versions of me I didn't recognize. Older, younger, disfigured, broken. Some smiled back, others wept, and a few simply stared with blank, unseeing eyes. As I moved deeper down the hall, the mirrors began to change. The glass rippled like water, and the reflections dissolved into strange blooms, grotesque, alien flowers twisting into shapes that defied nature. Their petals pulsed with dark veins that bled into the air. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the mirrored walls. I covered my ears, but it made no difference. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside me, resonating through my bones. At the end of the corridor stood a door, carved with the same spiraling bloom I'd seen in my dreams. Its surface writhed, alive with shifting patterns. The door felt like an invitation and a warning. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. The hum intensified until it felt like my skull would crack. But when I opened the door, there was no room behind it. No ground, no sky. Only an infinite void of swirling darkness, blooming in waves of ash and light. And something was waiting for me there. It had no face, no form I could name, but I felt its presence, a vast, unfathomable weight pressing against reality. It wasn't malevolent, it wasn't merciful. It simply was. "You were not meant to see this," it whispered, not in words but in raw understanding. "But you've always looked too closely." I woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, the hum lingering like a fading echo. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from an unknown number. "It's not a dream," My breath caught. The stranger. I knew it was him. Another message appeared. You've opened the door. Now you have to walk through it. I stared at the screen, my mind spiraling. What door? I wanted to scream back, but deep down I already knew. The visions became more vivid after that. I stopped seeing the world the way I used to. At work, the walls seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic breath. The sky outside the windows stretched too far, as if the horizon had been pushed back by something vast and unseen. I began to notice strange details in the people around me, eyes that flickered like reflections in water, movements that looped unnaturally. I watched Jeremy pour coffee 3 times in the same exact sequence, down to the tilt of his head and the timing of his nod. No one else seemed to notice. One afternoon, as I stared at the cracked mirror in the break room, the hum surged again, and I saw the bloom reflected there, impossible and infinite. It grew in slow, deliberate motions, petals twisting like tendrils, and behind it, just for a second, I saw them. The Wardens. Their forms were massive and wrong, spiraling limbs of ash and bone, crowned with fractals of light that seared the edges of my vision. They watched without eyes, their intent vast and cold. I stumbled back, gripping the counter for support. My reflection smiled at me, though my own face remained frozen in terror. You see them now, it whispered, but they've always seen you. The hum grew louder by the hour. I no longer knew what was real and what was a vision. The city felt empty, like a stage after the actors had left, and still the bloom called to me. I started walking without thinking, letting my feet guide me through streets that seemed to stretch and twist. The fog thickened, the buildings fading into silhouettes. At some point, I realized where I was heading. The riverbank, where I'd first seen the stranger. The water was darker than I remembered, its surface motionless. I knelt and stared into its depths, half expecting to see my reflection. But there was nothing there, only an endless churning void blooming beneath the surface. For the first time, I understood what it meant. The bloom wasn't growing, it was opening. I knelt at the river's edge, watching the bloom pulse beneath the surface. The patterns shifted with a slow grace, expanding and collapsing like a cosmic heartbeat. I couldn't tell how long I stayed there, minutes, hours. Time had become elastic, stretching and snapping back. A voice rose from the depths of the river, soft but resonant. You've come far. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. The stranger stood a few feet away, his long coat brushing the ground. His presence felt heavier now, like the fog itself had gathered around him. You said I was close, I murmured, still staring at the bloom. Close to what? He stepped beside me, his reflection absent from the water. To seeing the whole of it. I looked up at him, my throat dry. What is the bloom? He hesitated, and for the first time I saw something close to fear in his expression. It's the root of everything, he said. The bloom is the design, the shape of your prison, a seed that grows from suffering, desire, and memory. I shook my head, frustration bubbling up. Why? Why does it exist? What is this place? The stranger knelt beside me, his gaze fixed on the void-like petals below. Do you remember your dreams as a child? The sense that something wasn't right, that the world was too thin to hold itself together? I nodded slowly. I'd never told anyone about that feeling. The creeping dread that life was too fragile, like a veneer stretched over something vast and cold. That wasn't imagination, he continued. That was recognition. The hum returned, swelling in waves. The water trembled and the bloom expanded, its tendrils stretching outward like roots seeking the edges of reality. The stranger's voice grew quieter, more distant. Life is the bloom, he said. It grows from the ashes of truth. It gives you form, purpose, and pain. But it's not life. It's the mask you've worn since the beginning. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into something bottomless. My pulse quickened. So, this isn't real? The stranger's eyes locked with mine. It's as real as you make it. But the bloom, it doesn't stop growing. And when it opens fully, he paused, and for a moment I thought I saw his hand tremble. You see the truth. I swallowed hard, the hum thrumming through my skull. And the truth is, he leaned closer, his voice low and mournful, we're already in hell. The words hit like a hammer, shattering the fragile remnants of denial in my mind. I wanted to argue, to push the idea away, but I couldn't. The weight of it settled in my bones. "This isn't punishment for what you've done," he said. "It's punishment for what you are." The bloom pulsed again, casting ripples of distorted light across the water. I stared into it, hoping for answers and finding only reflection. Shifting forms that looked like me, but weren't. I saw my face twist and fracture, becoming something unrecognizable. I could feel the abyss pulling at me, its tendrils wrapping around my thoughts. The hum became deafening, each vibration like a chorus of distant screams. The stranger placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch grounding me. "You don't have to look," he whispered, "not yet." "But if I don't, what happens?" I asked. "You live in ignorance," he said almost gently, "but you live." I pulled away from him and stared at the bloom. Despite the terror coiled in my chest, I felt something else, curiosity. If this was hell, why did it look like home? Why was I given fragments of joy alongside the suffering? And then, like the answer was waiting for me to ask, the bloom opened fully. The world dissolved. For one terrifying moment, I saw everything. The endless cycles of life and death, the way every soul was pulled into the bloom, their memories and desires feeding its roots. I saw the Wardens, vast and unknowable, tending to the bloom like gardeners of ruin. Their hands weren't cruel or kind. They simply cultivated existence, pruning and shaping lives as if they were flowers to be harvested. I saw my own life stretched before me like a woven thread, every moment of pain, every hollow joy stitched into the grand design. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen. I was just fuel. The bloom wasn't hell's punishment. It was hell. I fell back, gasping for breath as the vision shattered. The stranger knelt beside me, his face drawn with something close to pity. "You've seen it now," he said softly. I nodded, tears burning in my eyes. "There's no way out, is there?" "No," he said, "there never was." I sat there staring at the river, the hum slowly fading into the background. The bloom was gone, but the weight of its truth remained. The sky above was pale and empty, the world a hollow stage. I could feel the bloom inside me now, its roots entwined with my thoughts. The stranger stood, his silhouette stark against the rising fog. "You have a choice," he said. "Forget what you've seen, or embrace it." I met his gaze, my heart hollowed out by the truth. "What happens if I embrace it?" His answer was simple. "You become part of it." The fog thickened as I stood at the river's edge, watching the stranger disappear into the haze. I was alone, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like something vast had coiled itself around me, unseen but unmistakable. The hum returned, deeper than before, a low resonance that shook the air and sent ripples across the river. The water churned, turning black as though something enormous stirred beneath the surface. I stepped back instinctively as the bloom reappeared. Not a fleeting shimmer this time, but a vast, unfurling presence. Its tendrils writhed outward, warping the sky and swallowing the horizon. The petals pulsed with blinding waves of ash and light, folding and unfolding in shapes that defied reason. And then it rose, a towering silhouette blooming from the void. The Warden. Its form was impossible, a twisting mass of tendrils and limbs that spiraled like a star collapsing in on itself. Its surface shimmered with fractal patterns, blooming with colorless fire. I couldn't tell if it had a face, but I felt its gaze pierce through me, vast and indifferent. The hum deepened, vibrating through my bones. I fell to my knees, the weight of its presence pressing down like gravity, multiplied 100-fold. The Warden didn't speak in words, it spoke in understanding. "You have seen it, now you understand." Tears streamed down my face as I tried to force out a question. My mind felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. "Why?" I whispered. The Warden's tendrils coiled and unfurled, painting strange symbols into the air. "Because this is what you are. You are bloom and ash, growth and ruin. Your suffering feeds the design." Its voice, if it could be called a voice, wasn't cruel. There was no malice, just truth. The bloom pulsed again, and I saw visions flooding my mind, cities crumbling to dust, civilizations rising and falling, lives sprouting like flowers only to be pruned. I saw the souls of the dead dissolve into the bloom's roots, their memories flowering into new lives, endless and cyclical. I saw myself again and again, living, dying, forgetting, returning. I wasn't a person. I was a thread in an infinite tapestry, stitched into place by something older than time. "No," I whispered, clutching my head. "This can't be it. This can't be all there is." The Warden's form darkened, its petals folding inward. There is no more. There is only the bloom. There is only the cycle. My thoughts unraveled beneath the weight of its words. If everything I'd ever known, every choice, every joy, every pain, was part of this endless pattern, then what was the point? I stared into the Warden's form, trembling. Why let me see this? Why me? The Warden shimmered, its shape expanding like a supernova collapsing in reverse. "You looked?" The hum swelled, deafening now. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to stand, teeth clenched against the weight. "I refuse," I gasped. "I refuse to accept this." The Warden's tendrils writhed, blooming outward in slow, deliberate waves. "Refusal is bloom. Rebellion feeds ruin. You are bound by what you deny." Its words cut through my defiance like a blade. I felt my knees buckle, but I didn't fall. "If this is hell," I whispered, "then who are you?" The Warden's form contracted, shrinking until it loomed just above me, its presence unbearably close. "I am not your tormentor. I am the shape of your truth." My breath caught. "Then there's no escape." The Warden's final answer echoed through the void. "No, but you already knew that." The bloom pulsed one last time, and the world around me shattered into fragments of ash and light. When the world reassembled, I wasn't at the river anymore. I was standing in the middle of the city, though it didn't feel like the place I'd known. The streets stretched too far, their edges bending away into endless fog. The buildings flickered, their windows dark and hollow, like vacant eyes. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating through the air, rising from the ground, filling every breath I took. The bloom wasn't gone, it had spread. I could feel its roots threading through the fabric of the city, blooming behind every surface. People passed by, their faces familiar but wrong. Eyes that didn't blink, smiles that held no warmth. They moved as if pulled by invisible strings, their conversations looping like broken records. I called out to them, but they didn't hear me. I ran through the empty streets, searching for something, anything that felt real. I passed the cafe I used to visit, the park bench where I'd read on quiet afternoons. Every place was hollow, a memory turned inside out. I stopped in front of the office building where I worked. The windows flickered with pale, static light, and I could see silhouettes moving inside. Co-workers I recognized, their forms jittering like distorted film reels. I stepped through the glass doors, though they didn't open. I simply passed through them, like a shadow through a wall. Inside, the hum intensified, reverberating through my chest. My desk was there, exactly as I'd left it, my chair slightly askew, my coffee cup half full. Rebecca was sitting at her cubicle, typing furiously. I approached her, my heart pounding. "Rebecca," I whispered. She didn't look up. Her fingers moved in rapid mechanical motions, typing the same line over and over. "We don't leave. We don't leave. We don't leave." I reached out and touched her shoulder. She turned to me slowly, her face blank and unrecognizable. Her eyes were empty voids, endless and dark. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The other figures turned toward me in unison, their faces melting into expressionless masks. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo, and I heard their voices, not in unison, but layered, a chorus of desperate, broken whispers. "You can't wake up. This is all there is. Why do you keep trying?" I ran, my breath ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. I burst through the exit and into the street, but the city had changed again. The buildings loomed higher, twisting into impossible shapes. The ground pulsed beneath my feet like a heartbeat. Above me, the sky cracked open. I stared in horror as petals of ash and void unfurled, filling the heavens with the bloom's terrible shape. Tendrils of light and darkness spiraled downward, weaving through the streets like roots sinking into the earth. The Warden was everywhere now, its presence vast and inescapable. The hum swelled until it felt like the air itself was collapsing inward. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, my thoughts unraveling under the weight of its song. "You cannot escape the bloom," the Warden's voice echoed through the hollow streets. "You are the bloom, and the bloom is ruin." Tears blurred my vision as I stared at the sky. "Why show me this if there's no way out?" I cried. My voice was swallowed by the hum, but I kept screaming, "Why let me see if it's all meaningless?" The bloom pulsed, its petals twisting into shapes that made my mind bend and fray. For a moment, I thought I saw faces, billions of them, woven into its design, lives stitched together in an endless writhing pattern. I was one of them. The Warden's answer came, cold and final. "Because you asked." I sank into myself, hollowed out by the weight of the truth. I'd spent my whole life searching for meaning, for some hidden order behind the chaos of existence. And I'd found it. But it wasn't salvation. It wasn't enlightenment. It was an eternal bloom of ruin, beautiful and terrible, growing from the ashes of every dream and desire. There was no meaning, no purpose, only the endless cycle. The hum began to fade, replaced by a hollow silence. The world around me dimmed, the streets and buildings dissolving like ash in the wind. I was alone now, standing in a void where nothing remained. Except for the bloom. It hovered before me, pulsing gently, its petals folded inward, shrinking until it was no larger than a flower in the palm of my hand. I reached out and held it, feeling its warmth spread through my fingers. The Warden's voice echoed one last time. "The bloom does not destroy, it preserves." I closed my eyes as the bloom's light enveloped me. For the first time, I felt still. Not free, but still. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't anywhere. Not in the city, not by the river, not in my apartment. I was suspended in a void that stretched in every direction, filled with faint whispers and distant echoes. The bloom rested in my hand, its petals dim and soft, pulsing like a fading heartbeat. The Warden's presence surrounded me, vast and formless. I felt it, like gravity, pulling me into the truth I'd been running from. "You have seen it all," the Warden's voice murmured, filling the void. "Now understand." The bloom unfurled once more, not outside of me, but within. I felt its roots spread through my thoughts, entwining themselves with every memory, every hope, every fear. And in that moment, I finally saw the pattern for what it was. I saw my birth, not the moment I entered the world, but the moment I was shaped. My soul, if it could be called that, wasn't something whole or pure. It was a fragment torn from something ancient and placed into a design far older than humanity. I was never an individual. I was a piece of the bloom, made to grow and decay again and again. The bloom didn't feed on suffering out of cruelty. It wasn't a punishment in the sense I had understood. It was a mechanism, a way of preserving existence through endless renewal. And every person, every life was a different expression of that preservation. I saw lives bloom and fade like petals in a storm. I saw the Wardens guiding the process, not as judges or overseers, but as caretakers of a cycle they themselves didn't create. The universe wasn't broken. It wasn't a mistake. It was exactly as it was meant to be, an eternal, unfolding pattern of growth and ruin. The whispers in the void grew louder, forming words that were both familiar and alien. You asked why there is no escape. The petals of the bloom turned inward, forming a spiral that seemed to stretch beyond infinity. There is no escape because there is no outside. There is no existence beyond the bloom, only the bloom itself. All you've known, all you've feared, is the same root system. You are its seed, its flower, its ash. My thoughts fractured under the weight of it. I felt myself unraveling, pieces of my mind scattering like dandelion seeds. But I wasn't afraid anymore. There was no point in fear, no point in resisting something as inevitable as gravity. I floated in the void, cradling the bloom, and I felt Peace. Not freedom, not joy, but peace. The stillness of something that had finally stopped struggling. The bloom didn't hurt me. It wasn't a cage made of malice. It was simply all there was. For the first time, I truly understood. Hell wasn't a punishment. It wasn't fire and torment. It was life itself, endlessly repeating, endlessly flowering into new forms of pain and beauty. We suffered not because we had sinned, but because suffering was the root of all existence. "There is no salvation," the Warden whispered, "only continuation." The void began to shift, the darkness softening into a dim, ash-grey horizon. I saw the outline of the city reforming around me, familiar yet different. The sky was pale and endless, the streets stretching toward vanishing points that never arrived. I was back where I had begun, but I wasn't the same. I could feel the bloom within me now, its petals brushing against the edges of my thoughts. I had become a part of it, and it had become a part of me. The hum returned, softer now, like a lullaby. The Warden's voice was the last thing I heard before the world settled into its quiet rhythm once more. "You wanted the truth, now live with it." I walked through the empty streets as the city woke around me. People passed by, smiling, laughing, living their lives in blissful ignorance. They didn't see the seams, they didn't feel the hum, and for the first time I envied them. But I knew the truth now, and there was no forgetting it. I wasn't free, but I understood. I had become one with the bloom, another petal in the endless design, and that, in the end, was the closest thing to peace I would ever know. As the sky brightened and the hum faded into the distance, I whispered the final truth to myself, a fragile echo in the quiet morning. "We are already here." The morning passed like a slow exhalation, the streets filled with the familiar rhythms of life, cars rumbling, distant conversations, the faint clang of a delivery truck. To anyone else, it was just another day. But to me, it was a painting hung on a decaying wall, beautiful but hollow. I sat at a bench near the river, watching the light ripple over the surface. The water looked normal again, reflecting the pale sky and the distant buildings. But beneath it, I knew the bloom still stirred, unseen but always present. Its tendrils ran through everything, through the city, the people, even me. For the first time, I didn't resist the hum. I let it resonate through me, filling the spaces that fear had left empty. It wasn't comfort, but it wasn't agony either. It was just there. A constant reminder that I was part of something infinite and inescapable. A woman passed by with a stroller, smiling as her baby giggled at the sunlight. I watched them until they were out of sight. In another life, that scene might have brought me joy or envy. But now I saw them for what they were, petals in the same bloom, blossoming only to wither. The Warden's words echoed in my mind. "You are the bloom." I wondered if the woman felt it too, if she'd ever woken in the dead of night with that gnawing weight in her chest, wondering why everything felt so fragile, so futile. Or maybe she was lucky. Maybe she'd never questioned the world deeply enough to see the seams. The hum grew softer, almost tender, as if acknowledging my thoughts. I closed my eyes, letting the sunlight warm my face. It felt strange to sit here, knowing the truth but unable to change it. I wasn't free, but I wasn't running anymore. Time passed slowly. I didn't know how long I sat there, an hour, maybe more. The river shimmered, the city carried on, and the world felt both unbearably vast and unbearably small. A crow landed on the edge of the bench, its head cocked as it watched me. Its black feathers glistened like oil, and its eyes held a strange glint, almost curious. I stared at it, half expecting it to speak, to deliver some cryptic message from the bloom itself. But it didn't. It was just a bird, living out its small cycle, unaware of the machinery beneath its feet. I let out a soft breath, somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "Lucky you," I muttered. The crow cawed once, spread its wings, and took off. I watched it until it disappeared into the sky, its dark shape swallowed by the pale horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt still. Not free, but still. The weight was still there, the hum still thrummed in my bones, but the fear had finally let go. There was no point in rebelling against what I was. Existence wasn't a battle to win. It wasn't something to escape. It was a cycle, a bloom that opened and closed, indifferent to the petals it bore. I was part of that bloom now, and no amount of denial or resistance would change that. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The hum was still with me, but it no longer felt like a separate force. It was woven into the air I breathed, the beat of my heart, the slow turning of the world. I wasn't sure if that was acceptance or surrender, but I didn't care anymore. I just existed. I walked aimlessly through the city, watching the people around me. They laughed, argued, texted, and drifted from place to place, oblivious to the bloom beneath their feet. They didn't see the tendrils coiling through the cracks in the pavement or the strange luminous petals unfolding in the sky just beyond their perception. I envied them, but only a little. Ignorance wasn't freedom. It was just another layer of the cycle. I passed by my office building and stopped at the glass doors. My reflection stared back, whole and ordinary. The cracks were gone. The face was mine again, unblemished and still. But when I looked into my own eyes, I didn't see fear anymore. A strange sense of clarity settled over me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hum deepened as I moved through the empty hallways, my footsteps swallowed by the silence. The office was deserted, as if the world had paused just for me. I reached my desk and sat down, running my fingers along the edge of the familiar wooden surface. My computer was still on, the cursor blinking in an empty document. For a moment, I considered typing something, some final message to the world. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the bloom rise behind my thoughts. When I opened my eyes again, the office was gone. I was standing in a vast field of endless blooms, their petals stretching toward a pale sky. Each flower pulsed faintly, their colors muted and strange, hues I had no name for. They swayed gently, as if moved by a breeze I couldn't feel. At the center of the field stood the Warden. Its form was smaller now, more defined, though still shifting like a mirage. It was no longer a towering god of ruin. It was a figure wrapped in ash and light, its edges soft and frayed. I approached slowly, the hum resonating through the blooms. "Is this the end?" I asked. My voice felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. The Warden's form shimmered, folding in on itself like a dying star. "No," it said softly, "it is the beginning and the end and everything between." I knelt among the flowers, brushing my hand over their petals. They felt alive, warm and trembling. Each one seemed to hold a memory, a life that had bloomed and withered. I felt tears slip down my face, though I wasn't sure if they were for me or for the world itself. Why do we bloom at all? The Warden's light pulsed gently. Because to bloom is to exist, and existence cannot end, only change. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, surrounded by the hum of the universe. I didn't fight it anymore. I didn't ask for release. I simply was. The bloom swayed around me, infinite and eternal. I let it take me, let myself dissolve into its roots and petals. My thoughts faded, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of the cycle. In the end, I wasn't a prisoner. I wasn't free. I was just part of it. I stood alone in the field of blooms, their petals reaching endlessly into the horizon like an ocean of forgotten dreams. The hum was no longer a sound. It was a truth stitched into the marrow of existence. I could no longer tell where I ended and it began. And in that stillness, I spoke, not to the Warden, not to the blooms, but to the void itself. We called it life because we had no other word for it. We called it suffering because it gave shape to our pain. But what we never understood is that life was not a journey. It was the destination all along. The blooms trembled as though listening, their strange hues darkening with each breath I took. I looked out at the endless expanse, and a quiet horror settled over me, not the terror of pain or death, but the terror of permanence. We were taught to seek meaning, to chase salvation like moths circling a dying flame. But there is no salvation here. Only the bloom, opening and closing, indifferent to the hopes it bears. We suffer not because we are wicked, but because we are petals in a flower that cannot stop blooming. The sky above me twisted, petals folding inward like an endless spiral. I closed my eyes and felt its rhythm. the slow churn of beginnings and endings, each indistinguishable from the other. We were never promised freedom, only motion. We rise, we fall, we become ash, and then we bloom again. The cycle feeds itself, and we are its fuel. To ask for purpose in the bloom is to ask why fire must burn. A low pulse rippled through the air, the bloom swaying as though grieving. But here is the final cruelty. The bloom is not evil. It does not seek our pain. It simply is. And that is the horror of it. The design is perfect because it has no conscience. It grows from all that we are and turns it into what we must be. I felt the Warden's presence shift behind me, vast and still. It didn't speak because there was nothing left to say. The truth was already inside me, sprouting like roots through my thoughts. I knelt among the flowers and let out a slow, trembling breath. We are not prisoners in the bloom. We are its architects. Every scream, every question, every desperate claw toward meaning is another petal in its endless bloom. My voice cracked as I spoke the final truth, the truth I had been running from since the beginning. We are here because we belong here. We were always meant to be. The blooms pulsed in quiet acknowledgement. The Warden's form shimmered, folding inward until it became a shadow on the horizon. The sky began to dissolve, pale light pouring through the cracks in the world. I felt myself unraveling, my form scattering into petals of ash and thought. But I was no longer afraid, because I knew now there was no escape. There never had been. We've burned for so long that we forgot what the fire was for, I whispered as my thoughts dissolved. But I remember now, we are the fire, and this bloom will never stop. The light consumed everything, folding the world into silence. The hum faded into nothingness. And in that final moment, before I bloomed again, I whispered to the void, "We are already home."